Hello, everybody.
Hey man, how are you?
Hi, man.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Good to see you, everyone. How are you?
This reminds me of our first interaction on How to Web in 2010. You did
Oh
the
my God.
last bit of
ages
the
ago.
first day with your pitch to media presentation,
Oh yeah.
which probably everybody remembers because of very provocative gestures. But anyway,
I can't see anybody. It's total black.
that's fine. Look at me.
Okay.
So anyway, just before wrapping up the day, we've prepared this conversation with Mike, but we'll look at a different subject. So usually you get a lot of questions about how to pitch to media, how to create a story around your product, but
Yeah.
maybe there's something that I don't know if you're if everybody knows that Mike is not only the an editor for TechCrunch, but you're no longer the main editor for Europe. You're actually an editor at large at TechCrunch, right?
Yeah.
how-
TechCrunch is
what
a
does
big
that
global
mean?
organization now. We have, people in Asia, New York, San Francisco, London, Paris. We don't have anyone in Africa yet, but
Not yet.
no.
So as editor at large, we've seen you wandering around the globe into very
I've got TechCrunch socks on, actually.
good for you.
Look,
Into very
they got TechCrunch logo. How about that?
into very exotic ecosystems, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you've been to the Emirates, I think. You've been to Middle East a couple of times.
Yeah, a
You're
lot
going
more to the Middle East.
to
I think there's a
Beirut
lot of things,
now,
interesting things
North
going on.
Africa.
Mm.
How does technology and like creation of economical value through technology impact those ecosystems?
Well, I think what we've got to be cognizant of and sort of be aware of is that because of the smartphone, the whole world is changing and leaping forward in leaps and bounds. There's a really good cyberpunk novel you should all read called The Difference Engine, which was co-written with William Gibson, and it's all set in Victorian London when Charles Babbage does actually invent his computer in about 1850 or so. Instead of, because Charles Babbage invented the computer. First there was the calculating engine, which was in brass, and then he drew up plans for the difference engine, which was also in brass, but which was a programmable computer in about 1830, 1850. You have to look it up the exact date. And of course, the first computer programmer was Ada Lovelace, his niece, who was also, sorry, not his niece, but she was the niece of a famous poet whose name escapes me. Someone who remember? Byron, thank you. And The Difference Engine is a fantastic novel which posits the idea of what would have happened to society if computers had actually been invented in the 18th century, 18th, 19th century, and how would society have dealt with it? Without revealing too much about the novel, it's quite a long one, so I'm not sure you will get time to read it. It's quite big, but a big book. But the too long didn't read, shall we say, is that society doesn't handle it that well. And what's going on now is that we're handing incredibly powerful machines to the rest of the world, and they're doing all sorts of interesting things with it. Some of them are doing weird things. Some of them are doing fantastic things. And my work with this charity which I'm setting up in the UK called Refugees, which is a crazy mash-mash of the word refugees and technology, is about the idea that it's the 21st century now, and humanitarian crises should be far more addressable now because of technology than they were in the past.
Yeah, so you started Refugees like I think early this year. Yeah.
Well, actually, no. About this time last year.
Okay.
As a result of all the craziness that was going on and bodies being washed up on the shore in.
And Refugees has grown significantly in the past year. Now you have how many chapters or?
So we have about 27 chapters now around the world.
Yeah.
These range from full-blown big meetups and hackathons, such as in Sydney and Melbourne, in Hungary, in Paris, big events around technology and refugees, and right down to like small meetups, say in Istanbul or New York, etc. We've actually had events now in San Francisco, and this is a really kind of quite a revelation. You wouldn't really realize this, but a lot of people in San Francisco don't really understand what's going on. They're very unaware. I mean, a typical sort of San Francisco, Silicon Valley bubble to some extent. I'm not criticizing them for that everyone's technology obsessed there, but they're not very aware of the capability of technology to impact refugees' lives and the significant part the smartphone is playing.
So can you give you a few examples of, I don't know, technology put to good use for those people, for the refugees?
Well, there's everything all the way up from just, putting Wi-Fi in refugee camps to language learning and societal integration of refugees inside host countries. There's some very, very cutting-edge work now being done along the lines of blockchain. So how do you deliver aid to a refugee and make sure that aid actually does get delivered? There's now actual commercial startup in London, I think it's called Aid Tech, who are using the blockchain and combined with cards, so QR codes on cards linked to the blockchain, and that is on actual refugee aid, like food packages, whatever it is, clothes, and then you can check if that aid actually got delivered to that person. So there's obviously a lot of corruption in international aid at the moment, and so really sort of cutting edge work being done. One thing I do say often is that technology is not going to solve the refugee crisis, and it's not going to solve all of the issues to do with humanitarian crises around the world today, but we have to start the conversation, and if we start the conversation now, then 2, 3, 4 years down the line, we'll actually have some really, really good, interesting solutions that will at least alleviate some of the problems, even if they don't necessarily solve everything, of course.
What have been the barriers until now regarding tech refugees? I mean, in all honesty, if you think about Romania, we haven't got absolutely no refugees at this point, and I think there was a nice story in a newspaper. Some of the refugees from who were crossing Serbia or Bulgaria got the train in the wrong direction, and when they figured out that they are going to Romania, they jumped out of the train so they can take the right one. Fortunately or unfortunately, we haven't been on this refugee path until now. So we're not very familiarized with the issues that
Sure.
You would have.
Well, that doesn't matter particularly. In a way, if you kind of go with me on this, if you think about the refugee as a massive edge case scenario, this is the most desperate human being you can think of. They have been thrown out of their country. They may have no access to resources. Maybe they've lost all their money, their house, all their worldly possessions, possibly even their identity papers. They've got nothing, right? So this is a massive edge case scenario. They're desperate. Maybe they're hungry. Perhaps they have children with them. It's a terrible, terrible crisis. Now, if you can solve problems, someone in that situation, imagine what you could do with that technology to solve all sorts of other things going on in society. Homelessness, access to education, you name it. There's lots and lots of things that you could do. So if you can start thinking along those lines, and with that massive edge case scenario of someone who's really in desperate circumstances, you can do all sorts of things all the way up the pipe, all the way up the stack, shall we say, back to some of society's biggest problems. And actually, I think there's one thing, there's actually also an interesting commercial imperative going on here. If I may, just for a second.
Please.
There's in the valley right now, there's a really interesting movement going on called impact entrepreneurship. Impact entrepreneurship is a way of describing what we used to call social entrepreneurship to some extent, and that still exists. But the trouble with social entrepreneurship, was people found after a while, was that it just basically looked a little bit too much like charity and donations, and that doesn't really scale, that doesn't really sort of have an exponential kind of impact. Impact entrepreneurship is entrepreneurship in the sense of, trying to create scalable solutions. But impact is solving big problems to do with society, but at the same time being commercially viable and therefore self-sustaining. And I wrote a piece recently on TechCrunch about a new movement in the Valley right now called impact entrepreneurship, or impact tech for short. So there's an impact tech meetup now in San Francisco, which has got 500 people going to it, and these people get together to try and solve climate change, crazy things like climate change or aging or food crisis or whatever. And
is that like similar to, I don't know, Tesla or?
In a roundabout way, I mean, if you think about Tesla as a really interesting big project to wean the world off petroleum, yes, ultimately that does have massive impact on society as well. These projects are sort of focusing on big problems as an actual core function. And there's a new VC in the Valley now called 50 Years. Now, 50 Years wants to fund the world's biggest problems, whether it be access to education or climate change, as I said, etc. And the interesting thing is that they've been named after an article which was written by Winston Churchill in 1932. So I'm going to read out a little bit of that for you now, because it's really interesting. So in March 1932, Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, who was the leader of the UK during the Second World War, wrote an article for Popular Mechanics, and it was about what the future held. This was in 1932. And one of the things that he wrote was this. It's a big, long essay. You can Google it. It's called 50 Years Hence, if you want to check it out. And he said this: We shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately under a suitable medium. Synthetic food will, of course, also be used in the future, nor need the pleasures of the table be banished. That gloomy utopia of tabloid meals need never be invaded. The new foods will be practically indistinguishable from the natural products from the outset, and any changes will be so gradual as to escape observation. In other words, he was writing about lab-grown meat in 1932. In that essay, he also writes about potential for nuclear power, cell phones, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence.
That's something to look up.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
And this is the point. The reason I'm raising this kind of crazy bit of history is that people have been thinking about this for a long, long, long time. And what's going on, I think, is gradually, as we, everyone's, been obsessed with problems in our world, in the tech world, like, how can I get my takeaway meal delivered to me, A, that's healthy, B, within the hour? How can I get my laundry done? How can I ride share? These are all sort of, first world problems, let's face it. How can I get the best makeup for me from L'Oreal, right? First world problems. What's actually going to be the companies of the biggest value in the next 10 years are the ones that solve the absolute biggest problems. And that is actually the really, really fundamental point. Ultimately, having your food delivered in an hour is a lot of startups right now, like Postmates. They've raised now a unicorn $1 billion. But, to some extent, that's almost a feature of Amazon. The biggest problems, climate change, healthcare, education, need to be solved. And those actually are going to be the most valuable companies, right?
Right.
So if we start thinking about, in terms of impact technology, solving the world's biggest problems with technology, actually, it turns out those are going to be the biggest and most valuable companies as well. And that's all I think.
On that note, I think we can wrap it up.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I think this is really interesting. We'll look it up because, we were wondering about, doing something in that line of work at Tech Hub. Starting actually with agrotech. Hello,
Awesome.
Gabi.
Well, on a more practical point, I'll be around in the foyer, etc., and out tonight at the parties, etc. So come and say hi. Feel free to pitch me your startup for 10 seconds, and then let's have a drink. Mike@techcrunch.com is my email if you need me. Thanks very much, Bogdan.
Thanks, Mike.
Cheers.